The dust in the garage smelled of rot and old secrets as the false bottom of the heavy trunk splintered under Emily's touch. Among the yellowed news clippings of a violent bank heist lay a prison mugshot, the face staring back at her with a jagged scar and cold, predatory eyes. A face she had kissed every morning for 15 years. The gold of her wedding band suddenly felt like a shackle, heavy and suffocating, as the rhythmic crunch of gravel outside announced her husband's early return. The heavy garage door groaned upward, casting a long, distorted shadow that raced toward the corner where she knelt. Emily scrambled to hide the evidence, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But the shadow was already upon her. Mark stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the fading twilight, his usual warm smile replaced by a flat, calculating gaze that lingered just a second too long on her trembling hands. Before she could speak, a sharp, demanding knock echoed from the front door. Not a guest's greeting, but the heavy, rhythmic strike of someone who wasn't leaving until they found what was hidden inside. The tires of the SUV crunched over the gravel driveway. A rhythmic, grounding sound that usually signaled the end of a long day and the beginning of sanctuary. Naperville was drowning in the liquid gold of late afternoon, the kind of light that made the manicured lawns and colonial facades look like a high-end real estate brochure. Émilie Carver killed the engine, letting the silence of the suburban cul-de-sac wrap around her for a moment. The air inside the house greeted her with the familiar, comforting scent of lavender-scented furniture wax and the faint, clean ozone of the air conditioning. She kicked off her heels in the hallway, her bare feet finding the cool, polished hardwood. Her home was a temple of order, a physical manifestation of her belief that if the exterior was perfect, the interior would follow suit. In the kitchen, the marble countertops were already host to rising stacks of glossy brochures and invitation cards. The charity gala was only weeks away. And as a school counselor, Emily knew that appearances were the currency of trust. She began to align the cards, her fingers moving with the precision of a metronome, ensuring every edge was perfectly parallel. She filled wicker baskets with decorative straw, tying satin ribbons into bows that were identical in size and tension. The repetitive rustle of the ribbons and the smell of fresh ink were a balm, a cocoon of predictable, middle-class life, where every object occupied its designated, decade-old place. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound until she remembered the extra packing crates stored in the garage. She pushed open the heavy door, greeted by a sudden draft of cool concrete and the lingering metallic tang of motor oil. The overhead bulb flickered, casting stuttering shadows across the neatly organized wall of tools. Emily navigated past the lawnmower and the stacks of winter tires, heading for the far corner where the shadows pooled deepest. Her hand reached for what she thought was a cardboard box, but her fingers met a different texture. Rough, cold, and heavy. It was a vintage canvas duffel bag, thick with a layer of gray dust that clung to her skin like ash. The brass buckles were encrusted with a green patina of oxidation. As she pulled it toward her, the sound of the bag dragging across the concrete floor seemed unnaturally loud, a jagged scrape that vibrated through her teeth. Her heart gave a sharp, erratic thud against her ribs. The bag was heavier than it looked. As she tried to lift it onto a workbench, her grip slipped on the oily handle. The duffel hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The impact was enough to shear one of the aged brass latches clean off, and the internal frame groaned as it buckled. Emily knelt, her breath hitching, intending to simply tuck the lining back into place. But the gray fabric had torn away from the side. A trickle of fine, dry rot fell onto her knees, revealing a false plywood bottom. She hooked her fingernail under the edge of the wood. It gave way with a dry, splintering snap. The scent that wafted up was sharp and suffocating. Old paper, stale tobacco, and the chemical bite of 20-year-old printer's ink. Under the plywood lay thick bundles of documents bound by perished, yellowed rubber bands, and a newspaper folded into a tight square, its edges crumbling into confetti at her touch. She reached in, her hand trembling as she fished out a small plastic card. It was a driver's license. A younger man stared back at her from the plastic, his gaze hard and unforgiving. The name printed in the bold block letters wasn't Mark Carver. It read, Daniel Miller. Her stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. She pulled out a black and white photograph clipped to a yellowed intake form. It was a mugshot. A man in a prison jumpsuit stood against a height chart, his jaw thrust forward in a gesture of defiant arrogance. His right eyebrow was bisected by a jagged, pale scar. She knew that tilt of the head. She knew the bridge of that nose. It was Mark's face, stripped of its suburban softness and the dignified silver at his temples. The tips of her fingers went numb. The plastic of the license felt like a sliver of ice against her palm. Her breathing became shallow, hitching in her throat as she gripped the photo, her thumb leaving a damp, blurred smudge on the glossy surface. She unfolded the fragile newspaper page, dated June 2000. The headline screamed in bold, archaic font, Cleveland heist, trio in masks vanish with million. She read the description of the bank robbery in Ohio, her eyes darting over the words. Security guard wounded. Daniel Miller named as primary suspect. Vanished after a shootout. She looked down at the wedding band on her finger. The gold suddenly felt like a shackle, heavy and suffocating. Her entire life, the Sunday brunches, the shared plans for retirement, the way Mark whispered her name before they fell asleep. It all disintegrated into ash under the weight of this newsprint. The man she had shared a bed with for 15 years had built their reality on a foundation of stolen blood and total deception. The sudden screech of the garage door tracks made her jump. A long, distorted shadow stretched across the concrete, racing toward her corner. Panic, cold and electric, surged through her. She frantically shoved the newspaper and the documents back under the false bottom, smoothing the lining and slamming the broken lid of the duffel bag shut, just as the shadow reached her. Mark stood 3 paces away, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. Emily pressed her palms against her knees, trying to still the violent tremor shaking her frame. She forced herself to look up, to manufacture a smile, though her facial muscles felt like stiffened clay. Her palms were slick with a cold, greasy sweat that stained her trousers. Mark took another step closer. In the semi-darkness of the garage, his breathing was rhythmic, terrifyingly calm. He stretched his lips into his signature smile, the one she had always interpreted as a sign of complete sincerity, a slightly ironic, warm expression. He reached out a hand to help her up, but his eyes remained flat, scanning the room with a predatory efficiency. She saw his gaze lock onto the shifted tires, the broken brass latch on the floor, and the smudge of dust on her silk blouse. He took the handle of the duffel bag and slid it back into its corner, aligning it with the edge of the shadow with a precision that made her skin crawl. His jaw muscles tightened, a brief flash of tension before his voice emerged, soft and melodic, asking if she'd found the crates for the gala. Every movement he made now felt like a rehearsed maneuver, the calculated actions of a hunter assessing a new variable in his environment. Dinner was a masterclass in silent horror. Emily methodically sliced through a medium-rare steak, watching the red juices pool on the white ceramic plate like a Rorschach test. Mark talked about the office, about mundane logistical hurdles, but his voice was merely background noise to the screaming in her head. She shifted into the professional mode she used with her most difficult students, observing the micro-expressions she had ignored for over a decade. The slight delay before he answered a question, the way he compulsively smoothed his cuff, the absence of crow's feet around his eyes when he laughed. She realized she was analyzing him as a sociopathic patient. Every time his fork clicked against his teeth, she flinched, seeing the hidden aggression in the mundane act of eating. A loud, demanding knock at the front door shattered the tension. Emily dropped her fork. The silver clattered against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Mark stood up slowly, his hand out in a silent command for her to stay put. Through the hallway, she saw a man on the porch. He wore a faded windbreaker, his face obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap. He held a crumpled map, his voice a raspy growl as he asked for directions to the highway. From behind Mark's shoulder, Emily watched the stranger's fingers. They twitched nervously. He shifted his weight, his eyes never leaving Mark's face. The air in the foyer turned thick with a sudden, electric charge. Mark's hand, hidden by the doorframe, was clenched into a heavy, white-knuckled fist. As Mark explained the route, Emily's gaze drifted to the stranger's face. He wasn't looking at the map. His eyes were moving with professional speed across the facade of the house, noting the thickness of the window frames and the placement of the security cameras. He lingered on the deadbolt of the front door and the alarm sensor in the hallway. A chill raced down her spine. This man wasn't lost. He was mapping a tactical environment. When he finally nodded and stepped back into the night, he didn't head for a car. He vanished into the thick lilac bushes at the edge of the property. The moment the door closed, Mark didn't just turn the lock. He engaged the heavy security bolt, a measure they hadn't used in years. He moved to the hallway, his back to her, and reached for a ventilation grate in the wall. With a practiced flick, he popped the grate and pulled out a slim, black smartphone, one she had never seen before. The screen flared blue, reflecting in his dilated pupils. His fingers flew across the glass, typing a short, urgent message. His face was a mask of stone. When he turned and caught her watching, he pocketed the phone in one fluid, habitual motion. Emily didn't wait for an explanation. She bolted for the upstairs bathroom, turning the thumb turn lock with trembling fingers. She splashed cold water on her face. But the reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger. She reached for her phone to call the police, but her hand stopped inches from the screen. If Mark was a fugitive, her career, her reputation, the very safety of her children, it would all be incinerated in the fallout. She waited until the rhythmic thud-thud of Mark's morning jog faded down the gravel path the next day. The house felt hollow, a shell of a life. She retrieved a heavy brass key from a vase in the hall, a key Mark thought she'd forgotten about. It opened his private study. The room smelled of old leather and expensive tobacco. She stepped onto the plush carpet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She powered on his laptop. The hum of the cooling fan sounded like a jet engine in the silence of the morning. Her cursor hovered over the browser icon. She opened the history tab, and the list of links made her breath catch. Statutes of Limitations for Armed Robbery, Ohio. Prison Fire Fatalities, 2000. Daniel Reed Obituary. The dry clinical lines of a news report about a prison fire stared back at her. Daniel Reed had been declared dead in a cell block fire exactly 1 month before Mark Carver had appeared in her life, with a perfect pedigree and clean documents. That evening, as Mark slept in the sterile chill of the air-conditioned bedroom, Emily stood over him. She carefully peeled back the edge of the duvet. In the dim glow of the nightlight, a thin, white line of scar tissue was visible on his shoulder. He told her it was a childhood bike accident. She leaned closer, her face inches from his skin, comparing the jagged edge of the mark to the memory of the mug shot. The lines matched with a terrifying, geometric precision. Mark stirred, his breathing hitching, and she recoiled. terrified he would wake and see the hunter she had become. The next morning at the school, the world felt tilted. She sat across from a slouching teenager who was picking at his cuticles. Normally, she would employ cognitive behavioral techniques to reach him. But today, she saw in his defiant eyes the same cold calculation she now recognized in her husband. She found herself looking for signs of sociopathy in a 15-year-old, her pen hovering over her legal pad. Instead of a diagnosis, she found herself doodling the name Daniel into the margin, pressing so hard the ink bled through 3 pages. When she left the school, the sunlight felt too bright, too exposing. In the parking lot, parked directly opposite the main gates, was a familiar gray sedan with tinted windows. She slowed her pace, the keys in her hand biting into her palm. The driver didn't move, but she saw the dull glint of binocular lenses behind the windshield. The man in the windbreaker wasn't pretending to be a tourist anymore. He was a shadow, a persistent stain on her reality. The gray car pulled out the moment she started her engine, maintaining a disciplined 3-car gap all the way home. The escalation was silent but total. That evening, as Mark chopped vegetables for a stew, whistling a low, tuneless melody, Emily moved past him, ostensibly for a glass of water. His black burner phone sat on the marble counter. While his back was turned to the stove, she covered the device with her hand, pressing her own phone against it. The installation of the tracking software took seconds that felt like hours. The progress bar crawled. When he reached for the salt, she slid the phone back. The screen stayed dark, hiding the digital tether she had just attached to his life. She wasn't done. The next morning, under the guise of checking the tire pressure, she knelt by the rear bumper of their SUV. She felt along the frame until her fingers met a small plastic box held by a powerful magnet. A tiny red LED blinked at her. Nausea rolled through her. This wasn't just a lingering ghost from the past. It was a tactical encirclement. The ghosts of Daniel Reed's past had hemmed them in with invisible nets. She tucked the tracker into her pocket, glancing at the empty, sunny street that now felt like a kill zone. She needed to know the stakes. In the garage, she opened the trunk of Mark's car and hauled up the floor mat to reach the spare tire. Tucked into the well, wrapped in oily rags, was a heavy bundle. She unwrapped the cloth to find the dull, blue-black steel of a semi-automatic handgun. Beside it lay several stacks of $100 bills bound by heavy rubber bands. The paper smelled of basement damp and rot. On the paper band cinching the top stack was a faint, purple stamp. Cleveland National Bank, May 2000. She touched the cold barrel of the gun. This was the finality of it. Mark wasn't just a man who had run away. He was a man who had kept the tools of his trade and the spoils of his crime beneath their family car. At dinner, she forced her voice into a register of soft, maternal concern. She suggested sending the children to her mother's place in Wisconsin, citing the upcoming stress of the gala and the need for a quiet house to pack the baskets. Mark froze, a forkful of pasta halfway to his mouth. His gaze became piercing, a laser focus that searched her face for a crack. She held the gaze, using the same placating smile she used for panicked parents. She spoke of the need for silence, for the children to have fresh air. Mark slowly nodded, the tension in his shoulders ebbing just a fraction. Relief washed over her, cold and thin. At least the children would be miles away when the powder keg finally ignited. But the night offered no peace. She woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of muffled, vitriolic whispering. She crept to the top of the stairs, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Mark stood in the foyer, the burner phone pressed to his ear. His voice was a raspy, jagged thread of fury. He was talking about a debt, about how it should have stayed buried in the fire at the prison. He promised to settle the matter permanently if the calls didn't stop. The person on the other end must have laughed, because Mark slammed his fist into the drywall with a sickening thud. Emily pressed herself against the railing, realizing her husband was prepared to do anything to protect the illusion of his suburban life. The next morning, the threat became physical. Through the kitchen window, she watched a man in a windbreaker approach their SUV. He moved with a taunting slowness. He took a key from his pocket and, with a screeching, deliberate motion, dragged it along the side of the car, leaving a deep, silver gouge in the black paint. Emily stood frozen, clutching her coffee mug. The man tucked a white slip of paper under the windshield wiper. On it, in thick black marker, was a single number, 1,000,000. The man looked up, his eyes locking onto hers through the glass. He pressed a finger to his lips in a mocking gesture of silence, and then dissolved into the morning mist. Emily didn't wait. She ran to the bedroom, locking the door and sliding the dresser in front of it. She pulled the handgun she'd taken from the garage from beneath the mattress where she'd hidden it. The weight of the weapon was alien and horrifying in her manicured hands. She sat on the floor, her back against the door, and rested the gun on her knees. A call to the police would end her life as she knew it. Her practice, her status, her children's future. But silence made her an accomplice to a monster. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Mark was back from his walk. Emily thumbed the safety off, the sharp metallic click sounding like the final period at the end of a long, deceptive sentence. She wasn't a counselor anymore. She was a woman in a corner, and she was done being afraid. The kitchen table, usually a place of shared meals and homework, had been transformed into a cold display of evidence. Emily had laid out the driver's license for Daniel Miller, the edges of the Cleveland Heist article curling under the bright light of the overhead chandelier. The mugshot sat in the center, the black and white face of a criminal staring up at the ceiling. She smoothed the creases in the fragile newsprint, her fingertips picking up the faint scent of old ink. She was building an altar to the truth, a place where the lies of the last 15 years would finally be burned away. When Mark stepped into the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps died instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving a gray, sickly pallor that made him look 20 years older. Emily didn't look up immediately. She waited until he was fully in the room before she raised the handgun. The barrel was steady, pointed directly at his chest. "Sit down, Daniel," she said, her voice a low, vibrating chord of ice. Mark's hands went up instinctively, his fingers trembling against the backdrop of the white cabinets. He looked at the table, then at her, his pupils blown wide with the animal terror of a man whose fortress has vanished. He sank into a chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He began to speak, the words tumbling out in a raspy, desperate rush. He talked about the smell of burning hair and plastic in the prison block, the way the smoke had turned the world black. He described the sickening relief of realizing the records would say he was dead. He swore that every day in Naperville had been an act of penance, that she was the only thing that kept him from the abyss. He leaned forward, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes brimming with a frantic, pathetic hope for mercy. Emily listened, but the words felt hollow. They were just more layers of the same deception. "You didn't choose me because you loved me," she whispered. "You chose me because I was the perfect camouflage." The air in the room suddenly shattered. A violent, explosive crash erupted from the living room as the large picture window was kicked in. Shards of glass rained down onto the hardwood like diamonds. A gust of cold night air swept through the house, sending the newspaper clipping on the table fluttering into the air. Emily spun, the gun swinging toward the hallway, as Mark's entire posture changed. In a heartbeat, the submissive husband was gone, replaced by a coiled, lethal spring of a man. Two figures in black balaclavas burst into the kitchen, a blur of motion and violence. One of them swung a heavy object, catching Mark across the temple. He went down hard, his head hitting the floor near the dog's water bowl. The second man lunged for Emily, his weight slamming her back against the cold tile of the wall. The smell of stale sweat and cheap tobacco filled her lungs. A knife blade flashed in the light, inches from her throat. The man screamed at her, a jagged demand for the Cleveland bag. His spittle hit her cheek. Emily tried to bring the gun up, but a heavy boot stomped down on her wrist, pinning her hand to the floor and sending a jolt of white-hot agony up her arm. The man holding her down ripped the mask from his face. It was the tourist. His eyes were hard, glittery pits of greed. He pressed the point of the knife into the soft skin beneath her jaw. Emily felt a warm trickle of blood slide down her neck and under her collar. She froze, her heart hammering against the man's chest. A guttural roar erupted from the floor. Mark surged upward with a ferocity that seemed impossible. He caught the first man in the throat, the sound of collapsing windpipes sickeningly clear in the small room. The fight that followed was a blur of primal instinct. A framed family portrait was ripped from the wall and smashed over a man's back. Mark moved with a terrifying, professional efficiency, his movements stripped of any civilian hesitation. He slammed a man's head into the marble countertop, and a crystal vase shattered into 1,000 jagged needles. Emily scrambled into the corner between the refrigerator and the cabinets, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She watched her husband, the man who spent his Saturdays weeding the garden, systematically break a man's arm with a sharp, anatomical snap. He used a wooden cutting board as a shield, blocking a knife thrust and countering with a blow to the solar plexus that folded the attacker like a piece of paper. The transformation was total. The mask had slipped, and the man beneath was a creature of calculated violence. The second intruder, staggering back toward the hallway, pulled a revolver from his waistband. The roar of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet missed Emily's head by an inch, smashing into a ceramic crock on the shelf behind her. Shards of pottery and flour rained down on her, coating her hair in white dust. The smell of cordite and ozone replaced the scent of her home. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands over her ears, as the kitchen became a chaotic symphony of grunts, breaking glass, and the heavy, wet thud of fists hitting flesh. When she opened them, the man in the windbreaker was standing over Mark, his knife raised for a final, downward strike. Something snapped inside her. The passive counselor died, and a survivor took her place. She lunged forward, putting her entire weight into the heavy oak bookshelf that held her collection of rare cookbooks. The massive unit groaned, tilted, and then fell with a thunderous crash, pinning the man's legs to the floor. He screamed, the knife clattering away across the tiles. Mark didn't hesitate. He delivered a crushing blow to the man's temple, silencing the scream. Emily stood there, chest heaving, looking at the man she had helped crush. The line between her and the criminals in her kitchen had blurred into nothingness. Mark scrambled to his feet, snatching up the fallen revolver and leveling it at the remaining intruder, who was already scrambling back through the broken window. "Get out!" Mark roared, his voice like grinding metal. Emily didn't wait to see if they followed. She stumbled into the hallway, her fingers finding the heavy fob for the SUV. She heard the distant, rising wail of sirens. The neighbors had finally called it in. She burst through the front door into the cool night air, the engine of the SUV roaring to life as she backed it down the driveway. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of blood and shadow, carrying the heavy duffel bag. He dived into the passenger seat just as she floored it, the tires screaming against the asphalt. They were blocks away before the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. The interior of the car smelled of blood and burnt powder. Emily looked at the man beside her, the man she had just saved, the man who had lied to her for 15 years. "Where are we going?" Mark wheezed, clutching his side. Emily didn't answer. She looked at the blood on her own hands, then at the road ahead. The life they had built was a smoldering wreck behind them. There was no going back to Naperville. There was only the road, the money, and the truth that had finally set them on fire. The SUV tore through the darkened suburbs, a black ghost fleeing the wreckage of a dream. Emily's hands were locked on the steering wheel, her knuckles white as bone. Beside her, Mark, or Daniel, or whoever he truly was, leaned his head against the window, his breath hitching in rhythmic, painful rasps. The glow of the dashboard lights cast a sickly green hue over the blood drying on his forehead. "We need a plan," he muttered, his voice cracking. "We can get to the city. I have people—" "Shut up," Emily said. The words were flat, devoid of the soft, therapeutic cadence she had used for a decade. She wasn't listening to him anymore. She was listening to the sound of her own life collapsing. She pulled into a dark, overgrown alleyway behind a row of derelict warehouses. She killed the lights, but kept the engine running. "The cameras," she whispered. "The house cameras caught everything. They'll see you. They'll see the bag. They'll see me helping you." Mark looked at her, a flicker of his old manipulative charm trying to surface through the gore. "We can disappear, Em. We have the money. We can start over. Somewhere else. Just us." She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. He was a man who believed that life was a series of resets, a collection of masks you could swap when the current one got too dirty. "There is no us in a lie, Mark," she said. She reached for his arm and pulled him toward the thick screen of tuja trees at the edge of the warehouse lot. She knew this area. She had grown up 3 towns over. Behind the trees was a narrow, rusted gate leading to an abandoned rail spur. It was a blind spot, a place where the suburban surveillance state hadn't yet reached. They scrambled through the brush, the branches clawing at their clothes. The distant, mournful wail of a police siren drifted over the rooftops, punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic strobe of blue and red reflecting off the low clouds. Mark stumbled, his boots sliding on the wet grass. But she hauled him up, her strength fueled by a cold, crystalline fury. They emerged onto a side street where a nondescript, 10-year-old sedan was parked under a dying street lamp. She'd rented it 2 days ago under a false name, a contingency plan she hadn't even admitted to herself she was making. She fumbled with the keys, the metal biting into her palm. She threw the duffel bag into the back and shoved Mark into the passenger seat. As she pulled onto the highway, the silence in the car was absolute. She watched the white lines of the road disappear under the hood, a hypnotic, endless rhythm. Mark tried to clean the wound on his head with a handful of napkins from the glove box. The white paper turned crimson instantly. He looked small in the seat, his bravado leaking out of him along with the blood. She drove for an hour, weaving through the back roads of the county, her mind a frantic, ticking clock. Finally, the boxy, illuminated sign of the Kane County Sheriff's Department appeared through the windshield. Mark sat up, his eyes widening. "What are you doing?" "Emily, no. We can go to the border. We can—" She slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming as she skidded into the brightly lit parking lot. She hit the central locking button, the mechanical clack echoing like a gavel. "I'm not spending the rest of my life running from your ghosts," she said. Mark lunged for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He turned to her, his face a mask of betrayal. He began to plead, his voice a frantic, high-pitched whine that made her skin crawl. He talked about the kids, about the life they'd had. He tried to reach for her, his bloody fingers clawing at her sleeve. Emily didn't flinch. She looked through the windshield at the glass doors of the station. A deputy was already stepping out, his hand resting on his holster, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. She stepped out of the car, her hands raised high, fingers spread. The cold night air felt like a baptism. She didn't look back at the car, even as Mark began to throw his shoulder against the window, his muffled screams lost in the wind. She walked toward the light, her movements slow and deliberate. Inside, the world was fluorescent and clinical. She laid the duffel bag on the counter. The stacks of Cleveland bills looked like play money under the harsh lights. She handed over a small thumb drive, the footage she'd downloaded from their home server before the intruders arrived. It showed everything: the robbery, the gun, the truth. She sat in a hard plastic chair and began to talk. She gave her statement with a terrifying, robotic precision. She dismantled the last 15 years piece by piece, watching the officers' faces shift from confusion to grim realization. Hours later, she stood behind the one-way glass of an observation room. Mark sat in an interrogation booth, his hands cuffed to a steel ring on the table. The silver-haired businessman was gone. In his place sat Daniel Miller, a middle-aged convict with a hollowed-out face and a 1,000-yard stare. He looked at the mirror, and for a second, she thought he could see her. She didn't look away. She watched until the detectives led him away, his gait heavy and defeated. The drive back to Naperville the next morning was a funeral procession. She parked at the curb, unable to bring herself to pull into the driveway. A bright orange sign was already staked into the lawn. Seized by U.S. Marshals. The windows were boarded up with raw plywood, and a yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze like a festive ribbon gone wrong. The house, her sanctuary, was a hollow shell. She saw a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, peering through her curtains, her face a mask of judgmental curiosity. The social fabric of her life had been shredded. She went to the school one last time to collect her things. The hallways were a gauntlet of whispers. Teachers she'd known for years turned away as she passed. A group of reporters was gathered at the main gate, their cameras swiveling toward her like predatory birds. She didn't hide. She walked through them with her head held high, the flashbulbs exploding in her eyes like miniature suns. In her new, cramped office at a community clinic downtown, the air smelled of floor wax and cheap coffee. She sat at a metal desk, looking at a new student, a boy with bruised knuckles and a guarded expression. She didn't reach for her old manual on ideal social integration. She pushed it into the trash can. "My name is Emily," she said to the boy. "And before we start, I want to tell you something. A house built on a lie is just a fancy way to be homeless. It's better to live in the ruins of the truth than in a palace made of secrets." The boy looked at her, his eyes narrowing, searching for the catch. For the first time in her life, Émilie Carver didn't have one. She took a deep, clean breath. The weight of the masks finally gone. The road ahead was broken and steep, but for the first time, she knew exactly who was walking it.